Hello and welcome to another episode of Whispers from the Campfire, where the flames of our stories cast shadows on the unknown. Gather close, as tonight I have 15 true horror stories that will keep you looking over your shoulder. The stories tonight are situated in hospitals or nursing homes, the one place you can guarantee paranormal activity occurs. There are accounts of death in these stories, so if that's not for you, then I'll catch you next time. But for those staying, pop some marshmallows on a stick and enjoy the night's horrors. Midwife here. On a night shift, I was on my way to the labs to drop off some bloods. I saw an old woman in a hospital gown standing at the end of the corridor looking out the window. I popped into the nearest ward to grab a nurse, as I didn't know if this patient was supposed to be wandering about. We came out into the corridor and she had gone. We looked down all the adjoining corridors and there was nobody there. She just vanished. The nurse asked me to describe her so we could alert security, and the patient I described was identical to a patient that had died on their ward about an hour before I saw her. Security did a sweep of the hospital. There was no patients missing from the wards, nor any patients reported to have left the ward at any point. I was quite shaken. I was working nights in a rehab unit in a large Victorian building in Bournemouth. The building had several staircases and a basement none of us would go down at night. It was the time of night when it was just starting to get light outside, not quite dawn. Suddenly, from the staircase leading to the basement, there was an overwhelming smell of burning between the stairs and the front door. We looked for a source of the burning and could not find anything amiss. The smell disappeared as quickly as it appeared. We recounted this experience in the morning handover. Several of the day staff went white and looked at each other furtively, then told us what we had experienced was the burning monk. The story was that the building had previously been a monastery. A monk had been cooking in the kitchen located in the basement, and his robes had accidentally caught fire. He then ran upstairs on fire and out the front door. During shift change, my co-worker and I are talking to each other whilst walking to the break room to gather our things. There is a petite nurse or healthcare worker in scrubs walking in front of us to the break room. We didn't recognise her as our regular unit staff. We never saw her face as she never turned around. Well, she opened the door and entered the break room. We're close enough behind that I rushed to the door to keep it from shutting. As I opened the door prepared to greet this person, there was no one there. This break room does not have any other rooms, exits, or even a bathroom. My co-worker and I stood there dumbfounded, because we both knew we saw the same lady enter the room before us. Our description of her appearance was the exact same, and when we asked others if they had seen anyone matching her description, no one had seen her. We even had a co-worker tell us that they had just seen us two walk into the break room, but not a third person. By far the most bizarre and creepiest thing I've encountered in my life, and I have no explanation for it. I've posted this story before, but when I was working night shift many years ago, and shortly before I graduated nursing school, I saw a bedside figure that LPN told me was the angel of death. I was walking down the hall back to the nurse's station, and I'd peek into patient's room to see if everything was quiet. And in one room, I saw a human-sized shadow at the foot of the bed. Assuming it was the patient getting out of bed to use the bathroom, I walked on. I then remembered on walking past the next room that the patient in that room was too unwell to be up. I walked back and nothing. I checked on the person and they were resting. So I turned them and went back to the nurse's station. I must have looked off because the LPN asked me about what was up and I told her. She was a long-time nurse and a matter-of-fact person and told me what I saw was the angel of death. Scared the heck out of the other night nurses. That person did end up dying that day on the morning shift. I worked in an older community hospital for about 10 years. I had many instances of seeing and feeling things, but I never saw her. But was always told by the other nurses that there was a ghost nurse who would come around when a patient was not expected to survive. I had an experience once with a patient that really sticks out in my mind. The patient wasn't doing so well. He wasn't really with it. The patient couldn't use the controls for the bed, lights, TV, etc. This guy would scream a lot despite being medicated. Anytime he would scream, his eyes would dart around the room, almost like he was following something. We went in to do his medications and turn and change him to make him comfortable. Either me or my colleague turned the lights out on our way back to the nurse's station to chart info. A few moments later, his call bell came on and we immediately went back in. On entering, we saw all the lights were back on, and we hadn't turned them on. The guy at the time did not have the mental capacity to even control the bed. We were thoroughly freaked out. I'm an ICU nurse. One shift, a patient's son rang the hospital at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, saying he was sure his dad was dying. His dad had a severe stroke but was doing okay. Recovery would be difficult, but he wasn't expected to die and was pretty stable at the time. I was looking after him, but he was a lot of work because he had tried to get up but couldn't walk, so he would fall a lot. The son really wanted to come in even though it was past visiting hours, but you know, I'll bend the rules for a good cause. I figured, what the heck, it's a Saturday night, and told him to come in and sit with his dad. The patient died about 2 minutes before the son walked into the room. It was like a switch turned off and he just died. The last thing he said to me was, "Am I bothering anyone?" I told him of course not, even though he had some very frustrating behaviours due to his stroke. The son started crying and screaming, I knew it! How the heck he knew? We weren't sure, but we were all freaked out. I worked in a paediatric hospital and had always heard that the 4th floor right outside our oncology unit was haunted. I worked 3 12-hour shifts normally, but would pick up overtime and picked up a night shift in this instance. I was working in the NICU, which happened to be on the 4th floor, on the opposite side. The oncology unit had a staircase that was a shortcut down to the cafeteria, which was on the 2nd floor. At about 3 a.m, I was ready to take a short break and wanted a cup of coffee from the cafeteria. So I decided to take the staircase. I walked through the automatic double doors and saw a kid skipping down the hall. I called out to him as I was afraid the little kid had snuck out of his room. As soon as I called out to him, he turned, and in the blink of an eye, he totally vanished. A lot of other nurses and doctors had seen the same kid skipping in that same hallway. Of course, I chalked it up to just exhaustion and didn't really think much about it. But you are damn sure I didn't use that hallway at night ever again. I worked in geriatrics, nursing homes, for years, so most of our patients died within a few years of being with us. Anyways, I had a new patient move into one of the rooms in my hall that had a patient pass away recently. My new patient kept calling at night saying there was this woman who kept coming into her room and trying to talk to her. At first I passed it off as her being in her 90s and struggling with dementia. So I assured her that I would lock her door at night to make sure no one would come in. After about a week of this continuing to happen, I sat down with the patient and was asking what this woman looked like, thinking to myself she might just be hallucinating. And she proceeded to tell me that this woman had a pink robe with blue fuzzy slippers and her hair up in curlers, and that she would come in and sit at the foot of her bed and pat the patient's feet and tried to talk to her, but she couldn't understand what she was saying. I almost pissed myself when I heard this, because the patient that died in this room prior to my new patient went to bed every night in her pink house robe, blue slippers, and her hair in curlers. The incidents has stopped about 2 weeks after this. A few years ago, a patient with a do not resuscitate order passed away on my unit in the morning, and after this, a young woman got admitted to the same room later on. I was working that night, and we suddenly hear a shrieking coming from that room. We run in, and the woman is in the bed shaking. She said there was this woman in her room screaming at her to get out of her bed. She said the woman told her her name, and it was the name of the patient who had died in that room earlier that morning. I've been a nurse for almost 22 years, and the only spooky thing I've experienced happened about 6 months ago. I was conducting my morning medication round to patients who were awake, alert and orientated. I would chit-chat as I prepared everything, and when I was with this one patient, she says, "Who's the bald guy standing behind you?" I immediately had all over goosebumps and actually shivered. It was like the vibe of the room changed. It's so hard to explain, it was just a feeling of dread. I turned around slowly and of course no one was there. I can't remember what I said to her, but by the time I finished up, my hands were shaking. It's not the scariest thing, but I've never had such a strong fear reaction to anything prior to this. She ended up being discharged a few days later, and let's hope she took her bald friend home with her. I was working in a perioperative department. There is a charge nurse that I work with who had been a nurse for over 50 years. I'll call her Gail. Gail is incredible, the mama of the unit. Everyone at this hospital knows her and loves her. She doesn't take shit from anyone, but also has this kind of approachable demeanour. She is an amazing source of information. Anyway, I respect her immensely. Gail always opens up the unit early in the morning. She has a very set routine and arrives about 30 minutes before the first shift even starts, so that she can take her time writing out the schedule and tidying up the unit. So Gail arrived at the hospital early one morning a few years ago and parked in the large parking garage across the street. The employee garage is on the back side of the hospital, so it's easiest to enter through the supply loading entrance. This entrance leads right into the basement of the hospital, and you can choose multiple routes to make your way to various elevators or staircases. The most direct route to our surgical unit is to follow a very long hallway in the basement to the furthest elevator and then head up the stairs. Gail is making her way down the long hallways and it's pretty quiet, especially at 5:30 a.m. But on this morning, she sees a doctor that she had known for years, a well-respected cardiologist named Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith had been diagnosed with cancer a few years prior and had been in and out of the hospital for treatment and admissions during times of illness. Gail was so happy to see him because it had been a few months. As she saw him, he looked incredible. His treatments must have been working. As they passed each other, she said, "Dr. Smith, it's so good to see you. You look fantastic." Dr. Smith gave Gail a huge smile and said, "Gail, I feel better than I have in years. So nice to see you." Gail continued down the hall and up the stairs to the unit. She started preparing the schedule for the day, and surgeons started to trickle in to place orders and review patient charts. Gail noticed another cardiologist who had also worked there a very long time. She exclaimed, "Dr. Allen, I just saw Dr. Smith as I came in this morning. He looks amazing. I'm so glad that he's responding to treatment." Dr. Allen was silent, and he had a strange look on his face. He walked over to Gail and said, "Gail, Dr. Smith passed away last night on 6 South. 6 South was the cancer unit." Gail thought he was kidding, and she insisted that she had just seen him. But Dr. Allen assured her that Dr. Smith had passed away and was currently down in the morgue in the basement. The entrance to the morgue is the only door in the middle of that long hallway. Gail fell silent as she realised she had seen him walking past her as she approached the morgue entrance. She told Dr. Allen she must have been mistaken, as to not appear crazy, but she knew what she saw. She was pretty shaken up when we arrived for our shift, and after a few hours, she quietly told some of us what had happened. She retired last year, and we all miss her dearly. Every time I walk down that hallway, I get shivers as I pass the morgue. I was shrouding my first ever patient as a new graduate nurse. This man had been deceased for a few hours, and family had just left, and he needed to be bagged for the morgue. This man was around 6 foot 5 inches and in rigor mortis. It took a very long time to bag him because he could barely fit in the bag and we were struggling to bend his limbs so we could close it up. But this was my first shroud, so I wanted to make sure I was finished. Meanwhile, my patient down the hall had been calling for a while. He was a very unwell schizophrenic man who was a high falling risk and very impulsive. I ran directly from my deceased patient into this patient's room. I apologised for the delay and asked what he needed. He looked alarmed and kept looking past me. He was hesitant to speak. He goes, "Can we speak in private?" I said yes and asked what he needs. The patient says, "Can you ask him to leave?" I respond with who? The patient, now staring right past me, says, "The tall guy behind you." I've never ran out of a room so fast. I used to work at an old psych hospital. Halfway through the night shift I got floated up to another unit. They had a whole bunch of discharges that evening and most of the empty rooms hadn't been cleaned. I did one of the 15-minute lease safety checks. I wasn't sure offhand which rooms had been emptied, so I just walked by all of them and matched up a face with a name. One of the rooms had the bedroom lights off and an unmade bed, but the bathroom light was on and the door cracked open slightly. I went in and grabbed the handle to the bathroom door and started to open it. The handle wrenched out of my hand and the door slammed shut out of nowhere before I could open it all the way. Then I heard a violent banging on the walls from inside. I looked on the clipboard and saw that no patient was assigned to that room. I went to open the door again and sure enough, the bathroom was empty. Later that night, I also had the blood pressure cuff on the machine next to my medication cart go off on its own. The house supervisor, a woman in her 60s, had worked in the facility for nearly 30 years. She came up to my unit and I told her about the creepy events that had occurred. She turned as white as a sheet. She told me that 15 years ago, a young patient, a woman in her 20s, had smuggled a knife onto the unit. She went into the bathroom and slit her wrists and died. The house supervisor told me she could smell the iron-laden blood before she even walked into the room. Now, I'm not at all superstitious or a believer in ghosts, but that night was creepy enough to make me wonder. I was a new nurse working night shift. I was on a small unit tucked into a back hallway with only 8 beds. At the time, the other nurses and I smoked. We were never to be on the unit alone, so we would take turns sneaking off for a smoke break. We would go down the back staircase and leave the door open. So on this night, my co-worker took her turn and I sat at the desk doing some charting. I looked up to see a nurse I'd never seen before, standing and looking into a patient's room. She was in the old uniform of a white dress and cape. I said hello, and she asked where my co-worker was. I told her the bathroom, thinking to myself we had a new supervisor who was checking up on us. I looked towards the stairs as I said this, and when I looked back, she was gone. My co-worker came up the stairs within seconds and I told her about the new supervisor. She said to me, "That couldn't be. I was just smoking with Gloria." Gloria was our normal night supervisor. I don't know who I saw, but she appeared and disappeared just as quickly, and I never heard the doors to the unit open or close. I worked in a facility where I was allocated to the locked dementia unit in my assignment for the night. The unit had 2 halls, Hall 100 and Hall 200. No one was allocated to Hall 100 as it was shut down. I'd just finished my second round and was relaxing at the nurse's station, when all of a sudden, all the call lights came on in Hall 100. I stood up and walked to the doors, with every hair on my body up on end. I peered through the window of the doors and all the lights were off. This freaked me out a little, but whatever. On my last round, I was in room 207. The patient was non-verbal. I was giving her a clean and dressing her when she leans into me and says, "Don't let the babies play on the floor." I stopped and looked at this supposed non-verbal woman making a creepy statement, when then, I heard a little giggle just behind me to my left, and immediately the lights in the room went out. I'm telling myself that it is nothing as I walk over to turn the lights back on. As I reached for the switch, both the lights came back on, and the call light started to ring. I picked up the patient and sat her in her chair, and we both noped out of there. I didn't tell anyone this. Then later that morning, the aide from upstairs and I are taking out the rubbish. I told her about the lights in Hall 100 going off, and she starts talking about this one resident who she went to check on. They weren't in their bed, and she was confused, as the patient needed a lifter to be moved. She was calling for the resident when she heard someone say, "Come with us." And then she witnessed the patient crawling on all fours from behind the bed, and the patient started to scream and shriek. She said she'll never go back into that room, the room of which was 207. It was the same room and the same patient I had. Thank you for joining me by the campfire. I hope you're perfectly warm and perfectly scared. I hope to provide you with more stories around the campfire, and so be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support. And as always, keep the fire burning and the stories alive.